Hey, I'm Craig Newmark. American democracy is under threat, and we all need to work together to protect the country and to protect our democracy. It's kind of like in World War II, when everyone was expected to play a role, and the first part of this is for all of us to learn a little more and to work together, strengthening American democracy, strengthening the country. The Civic Life series is a big part of that, and the 92nd Street Y, New York, is the right forum for delivering all that. I appreciate your joining me. Thanks.
Welcome to Women's Rights and Backsliding Democracies at the 92nd Street Y. This is the first of a two-part series to explore how women's rights are inextricably tied to the integrity and durability of our democracy. This evening's program is the continuation of an earlier collaboration between the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Center at NYU School of Law and Ms. Magazine. My name's Jennifer Weiss-Wolf. I serve as Executive Director for the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Center, and I also lead strategy at Ms. Magazine and run its Women in Democracy site, hence the collaboration. I served as an editor on and contributor to 50 Years of Ms., the award-winning book we are also celebrating this evening, and we will share links to all of these in the chat. So the broader questions this series is exploring, especially important as we kick off 2024, how are attacks on democracy tied to gender equity? Can a democracy where women have never been equal really ever thrive? What can we learn from current fights to protect and expand women's rights in order to chart a path forward? This evening's session is focused on the United States. Next month, we will be coming back with a slew of global leaders to discuss international perspectives. I have the great pleasure of introducing our very wonderful panelists. I will start with Alexis McGill Johnson, who is President and CEO of Planned Parenthood Action Fund. Planned Parenthood provides vital health care to more than 2 million people each year at nearly 6,000 health centers across the country. Alexis is a longstanding champion for social and racial justice. She's a respected political and cultural organizer and a tireless advocate for reproductive freedom. Thank you so much for being here, Alexis. Next is my wonderful colleague, Melissa Murray, who is NYU Law's Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law, as well as the faculty director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Center. She is a co-creator and co-host of the popular Strict Scrutiny podcast and a legal analyst for MSNBC. A constitutional law scholar, an expert in reproductive rights and justice. Her research and writing are published widely, including her latest article, Dobbs and Democracy, in the Harvard Law Review, which is some of the good inspiration for what we're talking about today, and we look forward to hearing about that. So thanks for being here, Melissa. And finally, Pamela Shifman, who serves as president of the Democracy Alliance, which is a network of individual donors, labor unions, and foundations joining forces to build a just, multiracial, feminist democracy. She's also founder of Shake the Table, which is a global research and action hub that connects philanthropy and social justice movements. Over her career, Pamela has worn many hats as lawyer, educator, strategic advisor, executive director, social justice funder, and each undergirded by her commitment to advancing the rights of women and girls in a thriving democracy. So Pamela, thank you so much for being here. I feel so lucky that I get to engage the three of you in this conversation that couldn't be more important today. And the way we're going to proceed is this. We've got 4 questions that are going to be posed to each of you. So you will have the same questions to answer, but given your distinct backgrounds, I think your answers may run a pretty wide gamut of perspectives. And I'm really interested in hearing those perspectives, as well as having you engage with each other on those perspectives. So with each question, please do answer, and then feel free to just chat among yourselves. We'll call time when it's time to switch to the next question. So the first actually really does lean into that differing perspectives. I love that you come to the table with very distinct skills and perches from the kind of work you do. And truly, true brilliance here on this Zoom screen, whether the constituency is within the academy and scholarship, whether it's philanthropy, political leaders, activists, medical providers, and the media, all very influential players in the political landscape and in the social landscape as well. So I would love for you to each take a few minutes to describe your approach to the work you do, to how you phrase and frame the interplay between gender and democracy and democratic systems and principles in both the work you do in the constituencies that you serve. And why don't we start with you, Alexis?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And it's an honor to be on this panel with so many colleagues that I also love and respect their brilliance. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. You know, as you mentioned, Planned Parenthood, our affiliates provide healthcare to over 2 million patients annually in 600 health centers. And, you know, the way that I have approached leadership in this moment when we are watching descent of America into authoritarian tendencies is to really center the experience around the patient. Obviously, patients come to us for sexual and reproductive health care. They come to us for access to birth control, STI testing, breast cancer screenings, and yes, also abortion where we can provide it. But they go out into the world and they are experiencing the harms of not being able to engage in the political process because their voting rights have been undermined by restrictive anti-democratic laws, where they are worried about the criminalization, the very real criminalization that we just saw Brittany Watts experience in Ohio after a miscarriage. They are experiencing kind of concerns about their immigration status, and any number of issues. And so my job as the head of the Action Fund is also to ask the question, how do we bring together the issues around sexual and reproductive health care, understanding that they also intersect with a variety of issues that patients are experiencing across the board. So, for example, when SB 8 went into effect in Texas, which was the precursor to ending Roe, the bounty hunter provision for any patient who was getting access to care in Texas, they could let somebody collect a bounty on their head for doing that. I remind people that SB 1 was actually the anti-voting legislation that came into place. And so abortion, attacks on bodily autonomy and freedom and control are inextricably linked to our ability to express ourselves through our voice and our vote. And that has been very intentional. And I think that's really where our deep concern as an organization and as a critical part of a progressive movement that cares deeply around democratic traditions and saving people's healthcare lies.
So that was really helpful, Alexis, and a good place for me to pick up. I am a legal scholar, and so a lot of my work is focused on constitutional law. So I necessarily think about the ways in which law either enables or disables equal participation in society. And I often focus on the way that law has disabled women's participation. It's worth noting that when our Constitution was written in 1787, there was no discussion of gender. And in fact, women would not be explicitly mentioned in the Constitution until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified. And it's really only been a generation since 1973, when the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was interpreted to include prohibitions on sex-based discrimination against women. So the idea of women being constitutional rights-bearing citizens equal to men is a relatively recent one and a relatively fragile concept. And we see that expressed in the court's recent opinion in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, where the court overruled Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the twin pillars of the court's abortion jurisprudence. And in overruling Roe and Casey, the court noted that the right to an abortion was not explicit in the text of the Constitution, nor was it deeply rooted in the history and traditions of this country. But it also noted that Roe and Casey had a democracy problem, which is to say that the Roe court in 1973, in announcing a right to choose an abortion, took an issue that was fraught and divisive and should have been decided by the people through their state legislatures, and instead interposed the court's own preferred policy outcome, recognizing a right to abortion. And so in overruling Roe and Casey, the Dobbs court says that it was doing nothing more than restoring this fraught and divisive question to the political process and to the people to decide for themselves. And I'll note, takes a lot of cheek for the court to say that, because at precisely the moment the court is restoring this question to the democratic process, the court has done quite a lot to make it much more difficult for the people to express their preferences through electoral politics. So Dobbs comes on the heels of Rucho versus Common Cause, a 2019 decision in which the court said that there was no role for federal courts to play in policing partisan gerrymandering. That means that states like Texas have grossly gerrymandered their state legislatures, making it much easier to not only pass oppressive voting laws, but also laws that really restrict abortion and other forms of equal rights. And SB 8, which Alexis mentioned, is a prime example of the effects of a gerrymandered state legislature. In addition to Rucho versus Common Cause, the court has essentially hobbled the Voting Rights Act over a series of decisions, starting with Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 and culminating in Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee in 2021. There's also a case on the docket this year that will also take on another Voting Rights Act question. So again, the court is returning these very important questions of women's equality to the political process, and is doing so precisely at the moment where it has intervened to make democracy more elusive.
I also want to echo, I'm so grateful and honored to be on this panel with people I respect so much. And thank you so much for bringing us together, Jen, and also to the 92nd Street Y for hosting this conversation in this very important year for democracy. It couldn't be more important. So as Jen said, I currently am the president of the Democracy Alliance, but I want to go back to where I really, where my understanding of the interplay between gender and democracy really was formed, and I think has carried with me throughout my career, and I think hopefully can inform some of our conversations today. So I, in the mid-90s, during South Africa's first post-apartheid government, I was really lucky to be able to work as the legal advisor to the African National Congress Parliamentary Women's Caucus in this first democratically elected parliament. And so I was taught there by these incredible women, freedom fighters, who many of them had gone from prison, who were now in parliament, who really trained me and gave me the political education that I needed, that has really guided my career ever since. What was very clear then is that the connection between racial justice and gender justice and democracy, there was no difference. They were all the exact same thing. And I want to share one example of this. Leading up to the election in 1994, there was this unbelievably powerful grassroots effort led by women around the country in rural communities and in urban communities to reach women all over the country to ask them what a new democratic South Africa would look like and what it would mean for them. And that resulted in the Women's Charter. And I'm just going to read one very brief part of this because I think it's both inspiring and grounding. So what that Women's Charter says is, democracy and human rights, if they are to be meaningful to women, must address our historic subordination and oppression. For women to be able to participate in and shape the nature and form of our democracy, the concepts of both human rights and democracy must be redefined and interpreted in ways which encompass women's diverse experience. There is no democracy without women's rights. And while our side, quite honestly, has been a little bit slow to connect those dots, I think what is very clear is that the authoritarian right has been making those connections for decades, right? While we know that women's rights are central to democracy, they know that patriarchy and control of women's bodies are central to authoritarianism. So when they crack down on gender and racial justice, it's not just a side strategy, it's literally fundamental to the political project that they are putting forward. It is the entire full game. So this is true here in the US in 2024, as it was in South Africa in 1994. And we need to, I think, grapple with that. So at the Democracy Alliance, which is where I'm president, this is a network, a community of donors who are really working together to advance democracy and to build long-term progressive power in the United States. My job is to get more resources for the most impactful pro-democracy work for the near term, which is like 2024, but also for 2034 and 2054 and 2064 as well. And so as we work at the DA to protect the democracy we have and to build the just, feminist, multiracial democracy we need, we know that we need to support the work to advance racial and gender justice, which are actually the work to advance democracy, and to see those as the exact same thing. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
What's so fascinating to me is that at least over the course of my own career, I've never been a scholar, but I've sat in a lot of the seats of advocate, of writer, of somebody who thinks deeply about media and narrative, certainly of philanthropy. And that to me, and I hope that we can sort of dig into that more as the conversation unfolds, not just the work that you each do individually, but how you see it cross impact, I guess. Not just that funders, give financial support, but what kind of influence can they wield? How does scholarship undergird what everybody's doing? What are the advocacy strategies, and what messages are needed to help advance those? Those are things that I think about all the time, and that I think is one of the most ripe aspects of this question, this idea of what it means to look at democracy and gender together. I'm going to pivot us to the next question just to keep it going, but I would love for you to sort of keep thinking about that, your own perspectives and what you need from everybody else on this conversation, and what you need from each other to ensure that we have a really holistic and organic movement, especially, we know that the next 11 months ahead, at least, and possibly beyond, are going to be pretty hellish. The presidential elections loom large. We're surely going to be engaging in more and more discussions about gender as it pertains certainly to the presidential candidates, at least for some time, to their campaign strategies, as well as to the issues that matter to voters this year. It's been said many times in viral headlines, abortion wins elections. That's where we're at 2 years after the Dobbs ruling. And we've seen simultaneously how far some states like Ohio, where abortion won big, are willing to go to stymie and undermine democratic processes, to do exactly what you said, Pamela. It's not just a byproduct. It's not just a quick fix to not have a law pass. It's actually part of an undergirding ideology. So of course, there's the this one's hard to say, but I want to use my alliteration, ethics challenged Supreme Court, which will be ruling on abortion not once, but twice again this term. So I ask each of you, and I'm going to ask actually Melissa to kick us off this time, hopefully with some more commentary about the court, how you see this dynamic playing out in 2024, the intersection between the politics, between the court strategy, between the public education of our citizens in a critical election year, and not only what you see happening, but what opportunities are there. I think we do have some unique opportunities with abortion being as front and center and palpable as it's ever been. And then if you want to get into any particular reforms, particularly federal reforms, whether it is legislative process reforms, whether it's voting reforms, whether it's judicial or judiciary reforms, I'd love to hear what you think there too. So why don't we go in this order this time? Melissa, Pamela, Alexis.
Sure. So I'm going to solve everything for progressives going forward for this election right now. And let me tag back to your last question too, Jen. I think it's worth noting when we sort of talk about democracy, if you think about the classical definition of democracy, that's not what we have. If you think about democracy from ancient Greece or the classical period, it was relatively homogenous, like men of roughly the same social class, of the same racial and ethnic background, running things together. They were the demos. We have, or what we are aspiring towards, is actually a multiracial, pluralistic democracy. And that really hasn't ever been seen in the history of the world outside of the United States, and only imperfectly here. And it's an open question whether the concept of democracy can actually coexist with the idea of heterogeneity and pluralism. Like, I mean, as like the classical model does not allow for that. It really does require a kind of homogeneity. And we're seeing in other systems that we laud as democracy that things get a little bit dicey and, you know, maybe start slipping into what looks more like authoritarianism the minute more heterogeneous populations are admitted. So I think that's something we actually have to think about, you know, to what degree are we attempting to do something that really has not been seen and has not been perfected, certainly in the history of the world. And so, you know, just to sort of shadow that, like, this is actually something momentous that we are ascending toward. With regard to this election cycle, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that democracy is on the line. And I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that abortion politics is a winning message for those who want to further a multiracial, plural democracy. I mean, we've seen that over and over again. And as you say, we've also seen the backlash to that and the attempt to curb democracy. You know, for a group of people who were so excited about Dobbs returning the abortion question to democratic deliberation, they don't seem to like it when the people deliberate and choose to expand or preserve access to abortion. So that is definitely on the line. Women's reproductive freedom is definitely on the line in 2024, but the whole concept of a multiracial, multi-faith, plural democracy is on the line as well. And, you know, I have said this over the last 3 election cycles, but the Supreme Court is on the ballot too. And I don't think we've actually heard that said going into 2024. In 2016, we had a real opportunity to cement a progressive majority on the Supreme Court, a progressive supermajority. And it didn't work out. And instead, what we got was a president who was not even elected with a majority of the popular vote, naming 3 individuals to the United States Supreme Court and cementing a conservative supermajority on that body, a conservative supermajority that has overturned Roe and Casey, that has limited the prospects for the Voting Rights Act, and that has essentially blessed partisan gerrymandering. All of the things that we have talked about have been a result of the Supreme Court. If you were excited about the Biden student loan forgiveness plan and then were completely dismayed when it went away because of the Supreme Court, and it went away because of that conservative supermajority. So in this coming cycle, we don't necessarily have the opportunity to reverse that, but we do have the opportunity to ensure that it's not as long-lived as it likely could be. There are 2 seats that are occupied by Republican-appointed septuagenarians, Justice Alito's seat, Justice Thomas's seat. It is very clear that if a Republican is elected to the presidency, both of those justices are going to step down, and that president will appoint a new extreme Republican nominee that will be even younger, and that will prolong that supermajority for an even longer amount of time. If a Democratic president is elected, I don't know that they're going to step down, but I think you run there's a greater chance that there will be more natural evolutions on the court. And certainly some of the Democratic justices may step down and take that opportunity. But this election cycle, whether we want to acknowledge it explicitly or not, the Supreme Court's on the line too. Like, whether we are going to live with this conservative supermajority until our children are septuagenarians. So, I mean, when you think about it that way, that, as much as abortion, should be getting us to the polls. It should have gotten us to the polls in 2016, but I hope we have learned our lesson at this point.
Yeah, it is all extremely, extremely frightening. And as you said, Jen, the next 11 months may be hellish. I hope I can offer a counter to some of that, because I think there's a lot that will take a long time that are going to be harder to fix. And there's things that we can do immediately this election cycle, which I think is gonna have an impact in 2025 and 2026 and 2027. So, you know, we because the threats are so grave and so scary, we spend a lot of time talking about what will happen, what can happen what would happen if he wins, and if he is able to implement his authoritarian playbook, which he has said he will do. I mean, he has listened to what he says, take him at his word. He is going to do the things that he says he would do if given the chance. So there is that. But I think one of the things that we can do during this time that feels really important and hopeful is that we can talk about what is possible when we have governing majorities. What can we do that is actually going to be transformative, not just in our children's generations, but like in the immediate? What are the things that can happen in 2025 if we have governing power? And so, of course, this is about abortion. It's about bodily autonomy. And it's about that, of course, is inspiring a whole generation of people, especially young women voters, to get out during this time. We know that voting rights motivates people. I think for a long time, folks said, well, democracy is not that kind of interesting or sexy, but it's actually not true. People do care deeply, deeply about the right to vote. And I think it's clear, the right has explicitly made it harder for Black people and other people of color to vote. And we care deeply we care about voting because it matters, right? And so we know that we can codify voting rights in when we have governing power. We also know something that is very, very important to women and to lots of people is the care agenda, right? We were not able to get the care agenda passed as part of Build Back Better. We were able to do a lot, but we were not able to get the care agenda passed. The care agenda is deeply, deeply popular. Many people in this country, most people in this country know what it's like to grapple with caring for an aging parent, caring for a child, caring for a loved one. Like, we know that we can't do it alone and that we are asked to do it alone. This is a hugely important issue for voters. And I think it's really important to talk about finishing that job, right? We can do that. We can actually join the rest of the world in having a more robust care infrastructure for our country if we are able to have governing power. So that's one thing. And I think the second thing that I want to say is the presidential race is obviously very important, and who is the president makes a huge difference. So yes, and yes. Also, I think we need to think about the ways that leadership shows up at every single level of government, right? The right has known that school boards are very important, which is why they have taken them over, right? So those positions are very important. City council positions are very important. The water boards are very important. And it's very important who represents us in Congress. I mean, right now, the U.S. House of Representatives is run by a person who has said, quote, we don't live in a democracy, but in a biblical republic. Okay. That is the Speaker of the House. That is a direct quote from the Speaker of the House, right? He is anti-contraception. I mean, this is a party that is clearly so deeply misogynist and racist and is implementing something that is very, very scary. And we have a chance to change that. And I would be remiss, because I'm a New Yorker and many people are watching this who are from New York in the 92nd Street Y. The House of Representatives was lost last time largely because of New York. There were 5 congressional seats in New York State where President Biden won, and a Republican also won in Congress. So there's an incredible opportunity right here in New York for folks who are watching, who are from New York, to ensure that we actually flip those districts and that we actually make New York a pro-democratic state, a state that is implementing pro-progressive values, and that doesn't give this current speaker another opportunity to implement his vision in 2025.
Amen. Can we say that again and again and again? Because both of my co-panelists have really pointed to the real moment that we are in, which is it's easy for us to look at things through electoral patterns. I think in some ways that itself is a bit antithetical to how movements operate, right? Like elections are kind of temperature checks inside of movement work, but this real movement from the opposition, which is trying to control our bodies because it is in complete direct conflict with what authoritarians seek. It's not just a backsliding democracy. There are more countries now that are backsliding into authoritarianism than are actually trying to establish democracies. And that's really what's at stake here, right? It is the fact that you have leaders in the opposing side who are unapologetic about wanting hierarchy, who are unapologetic about their patriarchy, who are very clear, as Pamela just laid out, about the role that extreme religious nationalism they believe should be furthered by the state. And the challenge here is that they are building on top of a structural political advantage that they have, that they are now in position to lock in. So Melissa talked about the gerrymandering of the state houses over the last decade, obviously the judiciary all the way up into the Supreme Court, and the way in which all of these various institutions are now being aided and abetted by misinformation, by extreme polarization, and by the willingness of the opposition to manipulate democratic rules and really shift norms of behavior in the name of power and control. So when I look at 24, obviously I'm looking kind of in the rear view at Dobbs over the last couple of years, and the real impact that it's had on patients, forcing patients, as I mentioned, Brittany Watts, to be criminalized because of a miscarriage. Kate Cox, who traveling out of state to get access to abortion because Texas and Idaho actually are quite comfortable allowing patients to die because they don't want to follow federal governance around emergency medicine. So like the reality of what is happening on the ground matches up to the value structure that they are being very clear about what they espouse. And so when I think about 24, I think about the opportunities to build on what we have done over the last few years, which is, as Pamela mentioned, Ohio, right? I mean, we've had an incredible victory, but we also won a state Supreme Court seat in Wisconsin. We won 6 other ballot initiatives in 22. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we really are the governing majority. They've locked in these political advantages, but abortion issues around bodily autonomy are actually, much more expansive in terms of who they draw out. You wouldn't get the ballot initiative in Florida, which I think is also another critical opportunity for us to gain power and protect bodily autonomy next year. You wouldn't get the signatures that they just got without 200,000 Republicans crossing over to sign that legislation. You would not have won Kansas, Kentucky, Montana without many folks across age, across demographic, across race coming, and across rage, I should say, because we are all in rage, but without that anger of government coming in to make personal medical decisions about people when they know full and well they would like to be able to make those decisions and not have their politicians do that, not have justices or lawyers tell them what they can do with their own bodies. And so that's the opportunity for us to build in 24. We need to get a governing majority. That really helps us establish not only our, demonstrate the fact where people are with respect to supporting democracy and bodily autonomy, but it also gives us our first bite at the apple at federal legislation. Our challenge is to figure out, how we build a durable right, whether that is through federal legislation or getting back into the Constitution. I'll let my constitutional scholars lean in there. But as I think about the work that we need to do at the Action Fund, it is what are the conditions that I can create on the ground for people to understand how these laws make no sense for how they are living their lives and their values. What can I do to help them understand and educate them about the fact that 80% of Americans believe that they should be able to control their own private medical decisions, and yet 21 states now have bans or restrictions that limit their ability to do that because they're being governed by a tyranny of the minority. What can I do to ensure that not only are these electeds on the ballot, we're also holding accountable folks who are benefiting from these electors, right? How are we holding accountable corporations and universities and other folks who are sitting in these states for the benefit of lower taxes and the opportunities for deregulation, and then they're at the same time willing to sacrifice their workforce and the communities that they are living in order to realize shareholder gains. Those are the kinds of I think inconsistencies that are even broader than I think the democratic process, but that when you start to explain to, everyday Americans about what's at stake, they start to understand that their values and their ability to control their own bodies are being sacrificed for many of these other political projects, which they did not actually sign up for.
I want to lean in actually on what you said earlier in your remarks, Alexis, about movement building. And as you just listed several for listeners, when Alexis was referring to Florida and the 6 states that passed ballot measures, those were all abortion ballot measures. And there's, and that's the latest in Florida, that they're enough signatures to put on the ballot in Florida as well. But broadly, movement wide, when we think of movement energy and activism, both what's happening in state legislatures, and I imagine we will see actively on the campaign trail this year, goes beyond abortion and goes beyond reproductive rights. We surely see attacks on education, on how both race and gender are allowed to be taught and talked about in schools. We see curbs on other access to healthcare, gender-affirming care, and for kids and people who are transgender. How do we thread that needle for everyday voters too, both to things that they might care about and be things that might motivate them to vote, but really actually to the broader democratic dysfunction story, and what it looks like to be hovering towards anti-democratic rule. This time we'll start with you, Pamela. We'll go Pamela, Alexis, Melissa.
Well, I'm glad to have a chance to talk about state legislatures, because I think that is actually where we are seeing both the best and the worst play out. We are seeing the scariest laws being developed and implemented, and we are really seeing unbelievable progress and really exciting opportunities in ways that really impact people's lives. And I think it's partly about, to your point about movement, I think it's partly about being the ability of state legislators and movements to be able to work together to implement an agenda that actually serves people. So I want to just share 2 examples, because I think these are really inspiring examples amidst a lot of really unfortunate examples. So Minnesota is an amazing example. We recently at a recent conference had Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, who is the highest ranking Native American state leader in the country. Peggy Flanagan and Governor Walz, Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan and Governor Walz, have done something which is called like the Minnesota Miracle. They like to call it the Minnesota Manifestation, because they worked really, really, really hard to do a lot of progressive things that they were able to do when they got governing control, when they were able to win the governor and the state legislature. So I'm just going to read these super quickly, because it is important to remember what is possible actually, and that we can have nice things. So, they codified in Minnesota abortion rights, paid family medical leave, paid sick leave, transgender rights protections, driver's licenses for undocumented residents, restoration of voting rights for formerly incarcerated people, a tax credit aimed at low-income parents with kids, background checks for gun transfers. They banned conversion therapy for LGBTQ people. They expanded education funding. They required a carbon-free electric grid by 2040, and so much more. I think, and they were able to do that really because they prepared to govern, right? And so they worked very hard with all the community groups on the ground, groups like Planned Parenthood, to say, what are we going to do when we have power, and how do we pass the laws that are going to be that are going to help folks in our state to thrive. And they had a really bold commitment to move quickly when they could. So I think that's one thing. Also, Michigan, my home state, Governor Whitmer, I think did incredible things when she had leadership opportunities, which included starting with democracy, really starting with a series of pro-democracy bills, which would improve election efficiency, increase voter registration opportunities, and protect equal access to the ballot box. So in doing that, she then also, of course, repealed their 1931 abortion ban, expanded the State Civil Rights Act, advanced clean energy reform, She stood up for workers' rights. She repealed so-called right to work laws that are, a death knell to unions that really seek to weaken unions. She did all of that, I think, together with a set of really, really visionary state legislators. And I think what this shows us, actually, to me, the thing that's really important is that a freedom agenda, right? A freedom agenda is not only possible, it's wildly popular. Like, they won on a freedom agenda. And of course, that's mutually reinforcing, right? Because when we expand our freedoms and stand up for all of our people, we strengthen democracy. And of course, that's a virtuous cycle. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in November.
Could I say ditto? Ditto. I think a freedom agenda is incredibly compelling, and I think that's one of the ways in which we see the win, starting with Kansas last cycle. We saw the independence and the focus on asking what freedom from government interference means. In some ways that has I think been a very powerful lesson for Democrats to learn and understand. And at the same time, it's also freedom for whom, right? I mean, I think that's the other part of this, right? Who is actually able to benefit and access the freedoms that we are, spending so much energy fighting for? I feel like sometimes it's not hyperbolic, as Melissa said, but sometimes I feel a little bit on the it's more than coincidence. It's kind of moving down the line of conspiratorial to say that this is a play for the next generation, right? This is a play to control information, to control what people can learn, how our values of how we control our bodies. The opposition a few months ago made a point to say, one of the leaders of the Right to Life movement made a statement that her hope was for abortion to be thought of as unattainable and unthinkable. Unattainable, they've spent the last 50 years kind of, and accelerated over the last 15 years, trying to control through the state legislature gerrymandering process that got accelerated in 2010 to, again, control and build these consolidate power in ways that would help them control and shape these institutions' laws. And the unthinkable is around how you control information, how you control misinformation, and the way in which they are intent on not just the kind of conspiracy stuff that you may see on TikTok, but in the daily practice of asking medical providers to share inaccurate information with their patients as part of what a way in which they've implemented the laws banning access to abortion. So enlisting credentialed scientists to come into a conversation with a patient and give them misinformation so that they will make unthinkable what the patient wants to do for their own lives. And so the fact that they are normalizing the use of institutions, right, the trust that we depend on, and in healthcare, trust is everything. That's the currency on which we operate. Using those institutions to delegitimize in education, in healthcare, the tenets that also are the same ones that uphold democracy, I think, is the thing that we have to be incredibly vigilant about. We have opportunities with leaders like Whitmer and Newsom and others. And in New York State, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our own ballot initiative for 24, which we believe will be a framework and a blueprint for a truly rights-based freedoms around for pregnant people. But that the way in which we have to educate people to understand what is at stake and how we help them and help our media, which I think is also, subject, as we know, to a lot of misinformation and polarization, but should be the check and balance in a democracy as a fourth estate. Those are the ways in which I think anti-democracies are playing into these kind of legitimate institutions in order to to shift, us down the path of authoritarianism. And so I think that as Pamela mentioned, the states through the state houses, many of these bad laws, so to speak, they start in states where it's easy to get things done, and then they get exported across the board. They get tweaked, and then they get exported. That is part of a strategy to not just make things unattainable, whether you're talking about trans care or education or anti-DEI strategies, but they're also to be used as a way to define a problem that doesn't exist, organize people's sentiment and energy around it, and then offer this bad legislation as a solution, right? Creating a problem that didn't exist before, but makes you mad enough that it will engage you, and you can build power from that. And so I think we should really be looking in a very vigilant way about not just the specific legislation that's happening, but the part of the strategy that is actually reinforcing the political project we're talking about.
So I agree with everything that's been said. I wanted to toggle back to something that Pamela said, and I agree with wholeheartedly. We can't just focus on one axis of power, like whether it's federal, presidential elections. Like, we have to show up every single time and every single election. There's so much empirical evidence that shows that when people go into the ballot box, they will vote if it's a presidential election for the president and maybe the senators or whatnot, maybe governor if that's on the ballot, but they really drop off on the down ballot races. And as Pamela said, those down ballot races are also sites and locuses of power that we have to be attentive to. And so, I think ignoring or neglecting what's happening in the states and in the local is something we do to our detriment. Like, we have to literally keep our eye on 3 different balls: federal, state, and local. And we have to play in all 3 of those arenas. And we have to do all of that, like keep our eye on all 3 balls, while also recognizing that we actually have to turn out in overwhelming numbers. Like, the distortion that has happened in the electoral landscape as a result of partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering and voter suppression and everything else means that if you are actually going to be able to register your preferences, you have to have an overwhelming output. Like, a lot of people have to vote. That's exhausting for people, like, to maintain that level of interest over the midterms and the off-cycle elections and the big elections. Like, it's just exhausting. But we have to just sort of address that up front. Like, we are in the fight of our lives. And if you don't have the stamina to show up every single time, then you may get what you deserve. Like, we have to literally hydrate, stretch, limber up, and get ready to fight every single time the fight comes to us, and to go to the fight and to be part of that. And so, we are past the point where things will happen without us. Like, we have to be engaged every single time, and we have to be willing to go above and beyond. And we have to recognize that we're not always successful in the first instance. Everything we want isn't going to happen with one election cycle. We have to keep showing up. We have to keep showing up in overwhelming numbers, because that's the only way we win. That is what they did. They were in the wilderness for 25 years and more. And they kept showing up, they kept working their vein, and eventually it bore fruit. And it bore fruit in just really catastrophic ways that we are now reckoning with.
All right, Melissa, I think you just gave us our marching orders. So everyone listening, 92nd Street Y community, this is what comes next. But we're going to twist it just a little bit to like a, slightly more Pollyanna-ish version of, is there anything that's giving you really hope and inspiration right now? And it can be rooted in the admonition that Melissa just gave us about down ballot, up ballot, round ballot action that we have to take.
I'll say 2 things. Many things give me hope, but 2 things I'm going to say right now. One is, like, we are not alone in this country, right, with the struggles that we are facing right now. We know that, like, in 2024, half the world is going to live in a country with a national vote. So that's an incredible opportunity, right? 4 billion people are going to have the chance to vote for their future, including folks in this country. And we are going to be able to imagine a democracy in this country that has never been but that we can create, that can be. It has never been done before, but we can do that. So I think that gives me hope. And the second thing that gives me hope, honestly, every day is the organizers on the ground, the people who are going door to door in snowy New York, the people who are going door to door all over this country, who are like demanding to be part of this democratic process and saying like, this is my country, this is my world too. And I'm going to make it be so.
So I am energized by the fact that we're all here, that there is an audience here who wants to hear this information, who are energized and ready to work. I'm really, really jazzed about how younger people are engaged in this election cycle. And, again, I hope that despite all of the things that are going on in this world, they recognize that democracy isn't perfect. There is no perfect candidate. There is no perfect set of issues. Like, we are literally trying to make a more perfect union out of imperfect parts, and that they take that message with them, and recognize that this is a long-term relationship you're engaging with. Democracy is not a sprint, it's a marathon, and getting there is going to take a long time, and we're doing the work now.
I co-sign all of what my colleague said. I do think that I'd be worried if there were apathy. I'd be worried if there were indifference, and that is not what we see. Election after election, you can put a ballot initiative on the ballot in the middle of August on a Republican primary day, and people still show up. That is actually people who are educated, who are informed, who are care. And I'll just leave you with my favorite quote, the one I meditate on every day, by Alice Walker. It's the title of the poem. She said, "Hope is a woman who lost her fear." And every time I turn around, there are women, young people who are unapologetic, they are unafraid, and they are demanding their democracy, and they're demanding their rights. And that's to give us a lot of hope.
Oh, thank you all so much. 3 women who have lost their fear. You all give me hope. Thank you so much for this evening's conversation. Thank you to the 92nd Street Y for having us. Onward, everybody. Do your part in this election. Do your part in democracy. Thank you.